So the environmental movement really began with environmental concerns, the rediscovery of ecology with Rachel Carson and Barry Commoner in the late 60s and early 70s. And these ideas were picked up by the counterculture, the American and British European counterculture. There was also concerns amongst leading economists. The Meadows report on the limits to growth is a classic of early, if you like, environmental economics. There was also a concern from architects and designers who were very concerned about the destructiveness of modernist-inspired development in the cities, slum clearing, where actually just a lot of old buildings were knocked down and communities were incredibly disrupted, sometimes permanently affected by so-called creative destruction of capital. And there were also great concerns about pollution and waste, and these concerns greatly affected ordinary people. In some of the worst scandals in America, there was one called Love Canal, where a whole town had to be abandoned, really, because of a toxic waste dump that was underneath it, and there were rivers catching fire and things like this. So the origins of groups like the US EPA, our own Environmental Protection Authority in Australia, were all reactions to the extreme damage that industry could inflict on the environment, on the urban environment and the agricultural environment. So the circular economy is really an attempt to respond to this, and it's one of many. It goes back a long way, right back to the idea of spaceship Earth, for the countercultural idea that the Earth was like a spaceship, and that we had to husband its resources, look after its resources, its water, its air, and make sure that as travelers on this spaceship Earth we could survive, which in a way we're now beginning to realize is actually not necessarily inevitable, given the extreme pressure we're now putting on the Earth, as the climate science tells us. So the circular economy idea is actually an old one, but what it says is that we need a new model. We need a circular model of the economy which is restorative by design. So it places a huge emphasis on the role of design. And the aim is to keep products, components and materials at their highest utility and value at all times. This is a quote from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The main approaches taken up in China and Europe and elsewhere to achieve this circular economy is through the servitization of goods, that is, to transform products into services, so the company can take back the product after its use and then to reuse it, remanufacture it, improve it, and then give it back to the consumer to use for another 2 or 3 or 5 years. You can see this in photocopiers and certain other goods. That the other idea is the reuse of goods, of parts and of materials, where a company will, for example, take waste plastics and transform that into new plastics again, certain plastics, that is. And we'll talk about plastics in a minute. The other one is product life extension. That is the idea that it should be possible to make a product that is so well that it can be repaired and reused over many years. And that we all have examples of some things that last a long time. I have a British toaster which seems to be indestructible, and I'm full of admiration for the makers of it, because I wonder how they managed to make a living by selling such a robust product. The other very important idea in the circular economy is the elimination of wastes, so that looking at the supply chains, looking at how we make things and reducing and then eliminating waste in those supply chains all the way back to extraction. And then, of course, the role that the government must play is to pass on the costs of pollution, of environmental damage, back to the polluter. whether it's the user or whether it's the producer or the extractor. And this is something we've made very little progress with and really needs to be looked at. We've got carbon trading schemes, some carbon taxing, but we haven't really gone very far down this path, largely because large industries have sunk costs and that they're very reluctant to encourage, to pay for the damage they're doing, because this would raise their costs and make their business models unsustainable. And this is something really we're at the cutting edge of our concerns now. Yeah. Okay. So what are the main barriers? I've mentioned resistance by big businesses. Well, from a consumption point of view, the extremely low cost of many products, the way they're given away for free, and a lot of these are extremely damaging. Let me show you this cage of products. I don't know whether you can see them all, but these are nearly all free or very low cost. They're made in their billions. They literally in billions. Coffee cups, for example, with their PE plastic lining, 500 billion a year. Toothbrushes, 4 billion, likely to be 10 billion within 10 years or so. So these products need to be reconsidered and redesigned. And this is why design plays such an important role in this. Another barrier is the extreme speed of the consumption cycle. You know, this hyper-consumption where we will go to a coffee shop, buy a coffee, and off we go and then discard, when we finish drinking. That kind of speed is unprecedented. And as is the way that we're producing waste that we don't know what to do with. We can't recycle these wastes. We can't. All we can do really is bury or burn these wastes. And this again is not really a sustainable solution. Deception. Most consumers aren't aware of the damage that the goods they use are creating. In order to sell the goods, we disguise this damage. It's a bit like selling cigarettes. Say, oh yes, they're good for your throat, like they used to in the 20s. This can't go on. We have to change how marketing and advertising, what claims are made. We can't let some of the claims being made, we can't let them get away with it for much longer. Yeah. And many materials we're using are complicated. They're hybrids. They can't be reused. They can't be recycled. Why are we making them? And this is a huge range of materials. It's not just a few plastics. Carbon fibers, for example, they're a nightmare. Airplanes are made out of aluminiums that are full of basically all materials. We've got the whole damn lot of the range of materials in the chemical spectrum, all thrown into airplanes to make them ever stronger, ever lighter. Military materials too. A lot of them are extremely damaging to the environment. We need to rethink this. We need to get away from these post-cautionary ways of designing goods into more precautionary ways. And many goods, of course, can't be servitized. They can't be turned into a service. They're personal, they're individual. Clothing, for example, we need to change production in order to change consumption, but we need to change consumption in order to change production. Plastics, I've just mentioned them. They're everywhere. We make 350 million tons a year. And in 20 years, this figure is going to double. 90% of these plastics are now made from oil, actually over 90. And that means that 6% of all the oil production in the world, that's equivalent to the whole aviation industry, goes into plastics. And it's predicted to reach 20% of all oil production, with 15% of the total carbon budget taken up with this plastics industry, by 2050. So 25% of plastics are used at the moment only once. This amazing stuff in here, yeah? And 30% of the total we make are collected for recycling, but only 10% of the total is actually recyclable and recycled. So 150 million tons so far of plastics have gone into the ocean. In 20 years, there'll be much more by weight than all the creatures in the sea, and they will have further damaged the sea. As they float and they break up, they become smaller, they sink, and they poison and entangle fish and birds and other creatures. Microbeads, for example, are now in millions of tons in the seas. You can photograph them in plankton, and they get into the food chain. They get into us, It's totally unsustainable. When you look at the profits of the whole of the plastics industry the world over, it's around $40 billion a year. That is equivalent to the damage to the environment plastics is now creating out there in the world. We have to change what we do with plastics and how we make them. So that's just an example of the kind of barriers we have to this idea of the circular economy, and why we need to look again and at how we design, how we approach solving our environmental and indeed our social problems, because without this solution we are doomed. We are doomed.